Thank you for joining this journey of kindness, transformation, and true wealth. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And stay tuned for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the power of generosity, resilience, and the unexpected ways lives can change. Let's get started today. Stories about wealthy man mocks black waitress, forcing her to play piano, instantly regrets it when she stuns the whole room. Emma had always known that music was more than just a hobby, it was the very essence of who she was. At 25, she had spent her entire life dreaming of a career in music, but the reality of her circumstances often felt like an insurmountable wall. Growing up in a small, modest town in North Carolina, Emma's family had never been wealthy, and opportunities for people like her to pursue their passions felt fleeting, almost out of reach. Her mother, a hard-working single parent, had done everything she could to make sure Emma and her younger siblings had what they needed. Though life wasn't easy, Emma never felt deprived of love. Music, especially the sound of an old piano in the living room, was their constant companion. It was from the vinyl records her mother cherished and the old, slightly out-of-tune piano gifted by a kind neighbor that Emma's love for melody was born. Her mother had never been a musician herself, but she recognized the importance of nurturing Emma's creativity. Music became Emma's sanctuary, a safe haven from the chaos of the world around her, a place where she could lose herself in notes and rhythms that told her stories when words failed. By the time Emma was in her teens, she had already taught herself to play. The piano was her escape, her therapy, and she poured her heart into it with every note. Her mother would often listen from the doorway as Emma played long into the night, filling their small home with melodies that made the world seem just a little bit bigger than it was. Despite the challenges they faced, Emma always believed in the promise of her music. She participated in school recitals, played at church events, and even performed at small community gatherings. For her, these were not just performances. They were moments where she could prove to herself that she wasn't just another girl in a small town destined to be forgotten. But the reality of life was relentless, and as she grew older, Emma realized that dreams didn't pay bills. Scholarships for music programs were few and far between, and family responsibilities became more pressing. As much as she wanted to attend a prestigious music academy, the costs were insurmountable. So, Emma did what many others in her position had done. She set her dreams aside. She took up jobs to support herself, and when she moved to Raleigh, she found work as a waitress at the Velvet Room, an upscale restaurant known for its refined ambience. It wasn't an ideal situation for her, but it provided stability. What kept Emma going, though, wasn't just the paycheck, it was the piano tucked in the corner of the restaurant. Whenever there was a lull in the busy atmosphere of the restaurant, she would steal moments to sit at the grand piano and let her fingers glide over the keys. There was something comforting about it, something that grounded her in the face of uncertainty. The music, though rarely heard by the guests, kept her connected to the dreams she had nearly forgotten. It was as if, every time her fingers touched the keys, she was silently telling herself that it wasn't too late, that her dreams were still alive, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Even though she hadn't given up on the idea of a music career, she had come to accept the harsh reality that dreams were a luxury. Emma didn't know when she would have the chance to pursue her music fully, but she couldn't bear to completely abandon it. The piano at the Velvet Room became both a symbol of hope and a constant reminder of what she had yet to accomplish. While most of the other employees came and went, focused on their shifts, Emma's heart remained tied to the music she could no longer fully dedicate herself to. The grand piano stood there, a silent witness to her quiet struggle. For Emma, music was not just a career she had to fight for, it was part of her identity. It was the thing that made her feel seen, heard, and understood in a way nothing else could. But every day, she suppressed her desire to make music her life. She knew the harsh truth. Talent alone wasn't enough. The reality was that, without the financial support to pursue her dreams, she would remain trapped in this cycle of working just to survive. Still, Emma couldn't fully bury her dreams. The piano in the corner, even if it was often neglected by others, was her beacon of light in the darkness. Her path wasn't easy, and it wasn't what she had envisioned for herself as a young girl with big aspirations. But she held on to the quiet hope that one day circumstances would align, and she would have the chance to step into her music fully. For now, the piano would remain her secret. It wasn't about showing others what she could do, it was about reclaiming a part of herself that the world had tried to take away. It was about keeping the music alive within her, even if no one else ever got to hear it. Because, deep down, Emma knew that the music was hers and hers alone, and that was enough. The dream she held so dearly fade into nothingness. Though her life might have taken a detour, Emma knew that she was not defined by her circumstances. She was defined by her resilience, her dedication to her craft, and her unwavering belief in her talent. The piano at the Velvet Room was a small part of the bigger picture, her future, her dreams, and the music that had been a constant companion in her life. One day, when the timing was right, she would take that leap and make music the center of her world. Until then, the piano would remain her quiet refuge, reminding her of the dreams that were still alive, still waiting to be realized. Harrison's arrogance. Harrison Matthews was a man who knew the weight of his wealth, and he wore it like a crown. To him, the world was a stage, and he the star. Born into privilege, Harrison had never known struggle, never had to fight for anything in his life. He had been taught from an early age that money could bend the world to his will, that power was an inheritance, not something earned. His every movement, every word, carried the aura of someone who had learned to manipulate his surroundings to serve his ego. His arrogance was not born of vanity alone. It was the result of years of conditioning, a belief that others were beneath him, tools for his amusement or his use. When Harrison entered the Velvet Room that evening, he didn't walk into the restaurant as a mere patron. He entered as though the room itself should acknowledge his presence, as though the air should part for him. He had been in places like this countless times before, the sort of high-end establishments where the well-dressed staff flinched at the sound of his voice, where the maitre d' welcomed him like royalty. He knew the routine. The waiters, the sommeliers, the chefs, all of them were just pawns in a game, and he was the one pulling the strings. The arrogance that radiated from him was not just from his wealth, but from a deep-seated belief that he had earned the right to treat the world as his playground. That night, as he sat with his entourage, Harrison's eyes landed on Emma as she moved through the dining room. She was nothing more than a waitress to him, just another faceless worker in the service industry. Someone who existed to make his experience more comfortable. He had seen her before, of course, but tonight something about her intrigued him. Perhaps it was her quiet demeanor, her understated beauty, or maybe it was just the way she carried herself with a grace he had forgotten to appreciate in the world of money and power. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. To Harrison, the world was a game of chess, and the people around him were all playersome to be admired, others to be humbled. He decided, almost instinctively, that he would make Emma his entertainment for the evening. It wasn't that he had anything personal against her he didn't care enough to. She was simply in his line of sight, a convenient target for the sort of game he enjoyed playing. It was the usual routine for him. Find someone to belittle. Find someone to prove his superiority over, and watch as they squirm. It was a quiet kind of power, the kind that didn't need to shout, but instead hovered over others like a dark cloud. As Emma approached his table to take their drink orders, Harrison seized the opportunity. He had no interest in what she was actually saying or doing. His focus was entirely on watching her, studying her reactions, seeing how far he could push her without her breaking. He knew the power he held simply in his words, and he wasn't afraid to use it. "Emma," he said, his voice deliberately casual but with an underlying sharpness. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely someone as young and pretty as you has bigger dreams than just serving drinks." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was a casual question, but it was also a veiled insult. Harrison didn't think for a second that Emma could be anything more than a waitress. No. To him, she was just another person who had settled into her place in the world. People like Emma, people who worked hard to make ends meet, were meant to stay where they were. They were meant to remain invisible, to serve the needs of people like him, who had the luxury of deciding their own fate. Emma's response, soft and hesitant, only made Harrison's smirk widen. She had no idea who she was dealing with, no idea how little he thought of her and others like her. When she told him she played the piano sometimes, he almost laughed. In his world, talents like hers were irrelevant. No one cared about music unless it could be monetized, unless it could be molded into something useful for someone with real power. Harrison was no artist. He had no appreciation for the depth of human creativity or the raw power of music. To him, it was all just a game, a way to amuse himself at the expense of others. He leaned back in his chair, surveying her with a look that was both dismissive and amused. It wasn't enough that he had decided she was beneath him. Now he wanted to prove it publicly in front of his companions. He wanted to show everyone that Emma was just another cog in the machine, another nameless face that could be made to perform on command. He didn't care that his challenge was humiliating or cruel. To him, it was simply the way things worked. "Oh, really? A pianist?" he taunted, his voice loud enough for other diners to hear. "Then why don't you show us what you've got? There's a piano right there. Surely someone with hidden talents wouldn't mind playing a little something for us." Harrison's words weren't just a challenge, they were a test. A test to see how far he could push Emma before she broke down. A test to see how much he could dominate her in front of an audience. His companions chuckled along with him, sensing the game he was playing. They didn't see the hurt in Emma's eyes. They saw a show, an opportunity for a good laugh at the expense of someone who would never have the power to retaliate. But there was something in the way Emma stood there, quiet and uncertain, that made Harrison feel a flicker of something. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was a brief moment of doubt. But he quickly silenced it. There was no room for doubt in Harrison Matthews' world. He had seen this before, the way people like Emma would try to hold on to their dignity, try to stand their ground. He would crush it. It was just a matter of time. As he sipped his drink, watching her carefully, Harrison was so sure of himself, so certain that his wealth and status had already given him an unassailable position. People like Emma, he believed, didn't deserve respect. They didn't deserve the opportunity to be heard. In his eyes, they were lucky to even be in the same room as him, serving him and his friends. His arrogance wasn't just a trait, it was his armor. It protected him from the vulnerability of acknowledging the worth of others, of recognizing the humanity in people like Emma who fought silently for their dreams. Harrison didn't know it yet, but in that moment, he had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated Emma. He had underestimated the power of her quiet strength, the depth of her talent, and the resilience that had been building inside her for years. What he thought would be a moment of dominance, a way to reinforce his sense of superiority, would soon become the very thing that would unravel his confidence, his ego, and the illusion of invincibility he had so carefully built. But for now, as he leaned back in his chair with a smug grin, Harrison Matthews was convinced that Emma was nothing more than another footnote in his life, a person to be humiliated, a pawn to entertain him. What he didn't realize was that, in trying to crush her, he was about to witness something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about power. A test of talent. The challenge hung in the air like an unspoken ultimatum, and Emma could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Harrison's words echoed in her mind louder with each passing second. "Why don't you show us what you've got?" he had said, his voice dripping with mockery. She had tried to ignore him at first, to brush it off as the typical arrogance of a man who had never known real struggle, but now the moment had arrived. and there was no turning back. Emma knew this wasn't just about playing the piano. It wasn't about showcasing her skill or impressing a table full of strangers. No, this was about something far more personal. This was about reclaiming her dignity in a world that often tried to make her feel small. It was about proving, not to Harrison or his companions, but to herself, that her talent was real and undeniable, that the dreams she had carried with her all these years, hidden beneath layers of self-doubt and resignation, were not foolish or unattainable. She stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands felt clammy, her legs uncertain, but her resolve began to build. The piano, once just a silent companion in the corner of the room, now seemed to call to her, as though it recognized the moment she had been waiting for her whole life. In a world where she had been pushed to the margins, where her dreams had been silenced by the relentless hum of survival, the piano had always been her refuge, and now it was her stage, her battleground. Emma knew she couldn't back down, not because of Harrison's challenge, but because of the voice inside her that had spent years telling her she wasn't enough. This was her chance to silence that voice once and for all. She stepped forward with a quiet strength, each movement a defiance of the doubts that had plagued her for so long. Her fingers trembled as she approached the grand piano, the cool keys glimmering under the soft lights. But she wasn't afraid. She was nervous, yes, but fear wasn't going to hold her back. As she settled on the bench, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, the laughter, it all fell into a distant hum, leaving her in the stillness of the moment. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the world slip away. In that brief pause, she was no longer a waitress, no longer someone caught between the dreams of her youth and the reality of her life. She was just Emma, the girl who had always loved music, the girl who had once believed in the possibility of something greater. The first note came out soft, hesitant, as if testing the air before deciding whether to trust it. The melody of the piece she had chosen, an intricate classical composition, began to spill from her fingertips, each note carrying with it years of longing, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance. It wasn't just a song. It was a confession. A piece of her soul laid bare for the world to hear. Emma had played this piece countless times before, in the quiet of her room, at the church recitals, in the cramped back corners of the restaurant when no one was watching. But this was different. This wasn't just a practice session or a casual performance for friends and family. This was a test, not of her ability, but of her belief in herself. Every chord was an act of courage, every phrase a testament to the resilience she had carried with her all these years. The more her fingers moved across the keys, the more she felt herself letting go of the fear that had clung to her for so long. At first, the room remained still, almost unnervingly so. The patrons, once caught up in their own conversations, had gone quiet. She could feel their eyes on her, their curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in energy. She didn't look at them. She couldn't. Her focus was entirely on the music, on the emotions that flowed through her fingertips, on the piece that seemed to capture the very essence of her journey. The more she played, the more she allowed herself to sink into the music, and the more the room seemed to fade away. Her nervousness began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet confidence that she hadn't felt in years. The music filled the space around her, weaving through the restaurant like a tangible thread that connected her to every person in the room. She no longer saw them as strangers or critics. She saw them as witnesses to something real, something raw and unapologetically hers. The final chords rang out, and Emma's fingers lingered over the keys, savoring the last moments of the song. She didn't want to finish. She didn't want the music to end, because in that moment she was more herself than she had ever been. But the silence that followed the final note was deafening. The room was still, and for a brief moment, Emma's heart stopped. She didn't know what to expect. Had she done enough? Had she truly shown them who she was? Then, slowly at first, the applause began. It was soft at first, hesitant, as though the diners weren't sure if they were allowed to react. But as the moments passed, the applause grew louder, warmer, and more genuine. The clapping reverberated off the walls, a sound that filled Emma's chest with an overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't just a polite response. It wasn't just a simple acknowledgement of her skill. This was respect. This was recognition, not just of her talent, but of the person. She was the person who had poured everything into her music, even when no one was listening. Emma didn't look up right away. She stayed at the piano, her hands still resting gently on the keys, allowing the last remnants of the music to settle in the room. The applause continued, and she could hear the hum of voices around her patrons calling out words of praise, her co-workers joining in with smiles and admiration. But what struck her most was the silence that had preceded it, the stillness in the room that had hung over everything like a blanket, and the fact that in that silence she had found her voice. She had stepped into her own power, not through grand gestures or loud declarations, but through the quiet certainty of her talent. As the applause faded, Emma slowly rose from the bench, her legs shaky but her posture proud. She had done it. Not for Harrison, not for anyone in the room, but for herself. She had proved, in the most vulnerable and powerful way, that her dreams were not just fantasies, they were real. And nothing, not even the cruel mockery of a man like Harrison Matthews, could take that away from her. The room, once filled with the tension of judgment and expectation, had shifted. It had become something else entirely, something full of awe, of respect, of newfound understanding. And as Emma looked around at the faces now turned toward her, she felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. The test wasn't about playing the piano. It had never been about that. It was about believing in herself enough to face the world, to stand up to the doubts that had kept her in the shadows, and to let the music speak louder than any challenge or criticism. In that moment, she had proven to herself that she was not just a waitress. She was an artist. Transformation. In that moment, as the last note of her performance hung in the air, Emma was no longer just the quiet waitress at the Velvet Room. The weight of the silence that followed her playing felt like 1,000 voices, each one holding its breath, waiting to exhale. She sat at the piano, her hands trembling not from fear but from the sheer intensity of the moment. It wasn't just the applause that would come after. It wasn't the acknowledgement of her skill, it was something deeper. It was the realization that she had crossed a threshold, not just in the eyes of those who had watched her play, but in her own heart, in her very soul. She had given a part of herself away in that music, and in doing so she had transformed in ways she hadn't thought possible. When the applause began, hesitant at first, it was as if the entire room was coming to life again, slowly, cautiously, as though everyone was unsure of how to react to the rawness of what had just happened. The guests, who had once been so absorbed in their conversations, now stood in quiet astonishment, recognizing something they hadn't expected to witness, something authentic, something real. It wasn't just a performance, it was a revelation. People began to clap louder, some standing, others nodding in silent approval, their faces lit with genuine admiration. But none of it, none of the praise, felt like it came from the outside world. This applause wasn't just for the melody she had played, the technique, or the talent was for the courage it had taken to stand there, to reveal herself, to allow others to witness her vulnerability. It was for the person who had held on to her dreams for so long, despite the weight of the world pressing against her. Emma's hands remained on the keys, unmoving at first, as if she was afraid to break the spell the music had cast. Her heart was racing, but not from fear. It was from something else entirely, a mixture of exhilaration and relief, of being fully seen and understood for the first time. In that moment, she wasn't just Emma the waitress, she was Emma the artist. And more than that, she was Emma, the person who had chosen to fight for her own place in the world, despite the odds. She had dared to rise above the expectations that had been placed upon her, to defy the limitations she had once accepted as part of her identity. The room, which had once felt cold and indifferent, now seemed to hold its breath in collective awe. Even Harrison, who had instigated this entire ordeal, was silent. His earlier smugness, the arrogance that had been so apparent in his eyes when he first sat down, was gone. In its place was an expression Emma couldn't quite read. Was it shock? Was it discomfort? Perhaps it was a combination of both. But what it wasn't was the superiority that had so blatantly colored his interactions with her. He was no longer the one in control. His earlier attempts to humiliate her had backfired. In fact, they had done more than that. They had opened the door for her to claim the respect she had never thought she could demand. As she slowly rose from the piano bench, her legs wobbled slightly, but her posture remained firm. She didn't look at Harrison, not at first. She wasn't interested in his reaction, or in what he might think of her now. The transformation had already happened within her. She had proven something far more important, that her voice, her talent, and her very being were not to be ignored. She had faced him, his challenge, and her own doubts, and she had stood tall. Her music had done more than just fill the air with sound. It had shattered the walls she had built around herself. It had allowed her to step into a version of herself that was no longer hidden behind the mask of modesty or fear. The applause had shifted the energy in the room. The tension, which had once been thick with judgment and expectation, dissolved into something entirely new. Emma could feel the weight of the transformation not only in herself but in the way the other diners and staff regarded her now. Where before she had been invisible, just another face in the crowd, she was now someone to be respected, admired. Her co-workers, who had witnessed her struggle in silence, exchanged looks of pride. They had known her talent, but now they saw her strength. Her heart swelled as she caught their eyes. She wasn't just the waitress anymore. She was Emma, a woman who had the courage to stand up for herself, to reclaim her dreams in front of a room full of strangers. The impact of her performance rippled outward, touching every corner of the restaurant. A couple who had been seated near the piano stopped her as she made her way back to her station, their faces lit up with genuine appreciation. "That was incredible," the woman said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so beautiful." The man beside her nodded, a look of quiet admiration on his face. "Don't stop," he added. "You've got something special." Emma could hardly find the words to thank them. She had heard compliments before, but these words, spoken with such sincerity, felt different. They weren't just acknowledging her technical ability, they were acknowledging her worth as a person, as an artist. It wasn't about the applause or the praise, Emma realized in that moment. It was about what had changed within her, what she had finally come to understand. She had spent years questioning herself, doubting her own worth, believing that her dreams were too big for someone like her. But now she saw the truth. She wasn't just a waitress who happened to play the piano. She was someone who carried something unique within her, something that deserved to be shared with the world. Her talent was not just an afterthought. It was an integral part of who she was. It was her gift, her voice, and she had every right to let it be heard. As the night continued, Emma moved through the restaurant with a newfound confidence. She wasn't the same person she had been when she walked into work that evening. The weight she had carried, the self-doubt that had shaped her every decision, had lifted. Each step she took felt more purposeful, more aligned with the person she had always wanted to be but had been too afraid to become. The power that had once belonged to Harrison, to the world that had tried to define her by her circumstances, had shifted. It was now hers to hold. When she delivered the check to Harrison's table, his usual smug expression was gone. He still tried to maintain an air of indifference, but the cracks in his facade were clear. He barely made eye contact with her, his earlier confidence now replaced with something less certain, something vulnerable. "You made your point," he said, his voice tight. No need to rub it in. But Emma didn't need to say anything more. The power had shifted, and she didn't need his validation to know that she had claimed her place in the world. Her transformation was not one of outward defiance or confrontation, it was internal. It was the quiet power of finally believing in herself, of understanding that her worth was not defined by others. She had found the courage to show up, to face her fears, and to let her talent speak louder than the doubts that had once silenced her. Emma wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an artist. And no one, not even someone like Harrison, could take that away from her. Empowerment through authenticity. In the silence that followed her performance, Emma felt an overwhelming sense of something she hadn't realized she had been searching for. True empowerment. It wasn't the applause that lingered in the air, or the appreciative glances from the other diners that made her feel this way, though those were important. What had truly empowered her was the act of showing up for herself, of embracing the authenticity of who she was, and refusing to let anyone, especially someone like Harrison, define her worth. For so long, Emma had allowed the noise of the world around her to shape her perception of herself. She had spent years hiding behind the role she had been forced into, not just by circumstance but by her own fears and insecurities. She had been the waitress, the one who served others, who smiled politely and moved through her life quietly, never daring to take up too much space. But in that moment, when she sat at the piano and poured every bit of her soul into the music, she reclaimed her voice. It wasn't just the melody she played that spoke, it was everything that had been silent within her for so long, everything she had kept hidden because she feared it wouldn't be enough. The truth she had so long buried within herself now burst forth, unapologetically, and it was in that truth that she found her power. Harrison, for all his wealth and confidence, had no idea how deeply his challenge had struck at her. He saw it as a game, a way to entertain himself and assert his dominance. But Emma wasn't playing his game. She wasn't there to prove anything to him or anyone else. She wasn't performing to win approval. She was performing because it was the only way she could finally give herself the permission to be seen, really seen, not just for the job she did or the things others assumed about her, but for who she truly was. That night, she didn't need anyone to validate her talent. She simply needed to show up for herself, to let the music speak for the person she had always been but had been too afraid to let others witness. Emma's empowerment didn't come from defying Harrison in the way he had expected. It didn't come from confronting him with sharp words or standing her ground in some public display of defiance. Her power came from the quiet, authentic act of letting her true self shine. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable in a way that most people are terrified to bash, allowed herself to stand in front of an entire room, her heart laid bare, her talent exposed, without any armor or pretense. In that vulnerability, in that rawness, she found something far more powerful than any forced display of strength. She found an unshakable belief in herself, a belief that had been absent for far too long. It wasn't the acknowledgement of her talent from the crowd that truly empowered her, although that recognition was validating. It was the act of stepping into her own skin, of fully embracing who she was, without apology. For years, Emma had tried to hide the parts of herself that she feared others wouldn't understand or appreciate. She had muted her passion for music, relegating it to the background of her life, because she feared it wasn't practical, that it wasn't enough to make a living, that it would only set her up for disappointment. But in that moment, as her fingers danced across the keys, she let go of those fears. She played not just for the crowd or for herself, but for the girl who had once dreamed so fiercely of a future in music, but had learned to silence that voice over the years. That girl was still there, still waiting to be heard, and tonight, Emma finally allowed her to be. The empowerment she felt wasn't about winning any external battle. It wasn't about showing Harrison that he was wrong about her, though that would come later. The empowerment came from within, from the courage to face the fear of judgment, the fear of failure, the fear of being laughed at or dismissed, and to play anyway. It was about trusting in her own voice, trusting that she had something worthy to share, and choosing to let that truth be known, regardless of how others might receive it. For the first time in years, Emma didn't hold back. She didn't hold back her music, and she didn't hold back her truth. She let the authenticity of who she was shine, and in doing so, she realized that this was the real power. The power wasn't in trying to meet other people's expectations or seeking approval. The power was in knowing who you are and having the courage to let that person show up in the world. As the applause settled and Emma returned to her duties, she walked through the restaurant with a new sense of ease, a new sense of self. The weight she had been carrying for years, the weight of doubt, of feeling unworthy, of feeling unseen, was suddenly gone. It wasn't that she had conquered anything on the outside, it was that she had finally conquered the internal battle, the one that told her she wasn't enough, that she didn't deserve to take up space. She had quieted that voice, and in doing so, she had made room for her authentic self to emerge, free of fear and shame. The room had shifted, but not because of her performance. The shift had already happened within her. She had proven to herself that her worth was not tied to external validation or approval. It was inherent in who she was, in her talents, in her resilience, and no one, not even someone like Harrison, could take that away from her. The applause she received wasn't just for the music, it was for the woman she had become, for the courage it had taken to stand in her own truth. Harrison, sitting at his table, might have thought he had merely orchestrated a performance, a way to humiliate her for his own amusement. But he had failed to realize that Emma had been playing a much bigger game. His attempt to diminish her had only led her to discover her own strength, her own worth, and in doing so, he had been the one who had lost. It was a loss he couldn't comprehend, for his power had always been external. He had never known what it meant to be powerful in the way that Emma had just become. Emma's story was one of quiet revolution. She had fought no battles, made no speeches, but in that small, intimate space, she had done something that few people ever truly had embraced her authentic self. And in that authenticity, she had found the kind of power that no one could take from her. It was the power that comes from within. The power of knowing that who you are is enough, that your dreams, your passions, and your gifts are worthy of being shared with the world. This was Emma's true empowerment, not in conquering others, but in conquering her own self-doubt and embracing the fullness of her potential. New opportunities. In the days that followed her transformative performance, Emma felt a shift within her that went far beyond the applause she had received or the stunned silence of the room. What lingered with her was a profound sense of possibility, sense that her life had changed in ways she had not anticipated. The courage she had summoned to step into her truth, to embrace the woman she had always wanted to be but had been too afraid to become, had opened a door she hadn't even known existed. And as she stood at the threshold, she realized that it wasn't just about the recognition she had earned that night. It was about the path it had created for her moving forward. The next few days felt like a haze of new energy and new opportunities, as though the universe had taken notice of her moment of courage and decided to match it with its own gifts. The customers who had witnessed her performance shared the story with others, recounting how they had watched the young waitress rise from an ordinary role to a remarkable moment, transforming the entire atmosphere of the restaurant with nothing but her music. The story spread beyond the walls of the Velvet Room, creating ripples that reached people Emma had never met, people who saw in her performance something deeply human, something inspiring. It was no longer just about a young woman playing the piano. It was about a young woman who had overcome fear, doubt, and the limiting beliefs that had once held her back to claim her place in the world. One afternoon, as Emma was working the lunch shift, she felt the phone on her tray buzz with an unfamiliar number. She was used to answering calls for orders or reservations, But this time the voice on the other end of the line caught her off guard. It was a man, introducing himself as a music producer, someone who had been dining at the Velvet Room the night of her performance. His voice was calm, professional, but there was an undeniable enthusiasm in his tone. He explained that he had been deeply moved by her music, that he had been watching her perform with a sense of awe, not just for her technical skill, but for the raw, emotional depth that had filled the room. "I'm not offering fame," he said, "but I'd love to record a demo with you if you're interested. It could be a step towards something bigger. A chance to share your talent with others who need to hear it." For a moment, Emma didn't know how to respond. The words felt surreal. She had always dreamed of such an opportunity, of having someone recognize her talent beyond the confines of the Velvet Room, but to hear it spoken aloud felt almost like an out-of-body experience. She had spent years doubting herself, telling herself that she wasn't worthy of such opportunities, that her dreams were too big, too far removed from the reality she lived. But now, this offer was standing in front of her, tangible, real, and within her reach. It was an opportunity she had never expected, but one that felt so right, so in alignment with everything she had worked for. "Of course," she finally replied, her voice steady but her heart racing. "I'd love that." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of numerous rehearsals, late-night phone calls with the producer, and moments of quiet reflection as she worked to balance her shift at the Velvet Room with the new opportunities that had come her way. Each day brought something fresh, a new chance to step into the life she had always dreamed of. But it wasn't just about the external changes offers, the opportunities, it was about the internal transformation that had made all of this possible. Emma had stepped into a new version of herself, one that no longer shrank back in the face of fear, but stood tall and faced the unknown with confidence. She no longer doubted whether she was worthy of these opportunities, as she knew now that she was. The demo recording process itself was a revelation. Emma had always kept her music to herself, sharing it with only a few close friends or playing in the quiet moments when no one was watching. But now, she was in a professional studio, surrounded by people who believed in her gift, who saw her not as the waitress at a high-end restaurant, but as an artist in her own right. The producer's encouragement and the studio's environment gave her the space to truly explore her sound, to experiment, to take risks that she had never allowed herself to take before. In that space, Emma found a new level of freedom, one that was born from trusting her instincts, from knowing that the music she made had value and meaning, regardless of whether it was shared with the world or kept private. With each new track, Emma felt the distance between the girl who had played in her room alone and the woman who was now creating music for others to hear. The transition wasn't instantaneous, it was slow and gradual, built on the foundation of the bravery she had shown on that fateful night at the Velvet Room. That night had been the catalyst, the moment that pushed her to believe that her dreams weren't too big, that she wasn't too small, she was enough, and her music had a place in the world. As the demo neared completion, Emma's confidence grew, not because of the validation she received, but because of the quiet belief she had finally cultivated within herself. She was not waiting for permission to take up space. She was taking it, carving out her place in the world one note at a time, and the opportunities didn't stop coming. The producer sent the demo to a few contacts, and soon Emma found herself in conversations with people who were genuinely interested in her music. There were offers for gigs, invitations to collaborate with other musicians, and the possibility of performing at more prominent venues. What had once seemed like a distant dream was now unfolding before her, and it was unfolding not because of external circumstances, but because she had stepped into her own power and allowed herself to fully embrace her potential. The biggest shift, however, wasn't in the offers or the attention she was receiving, it was in Emma herself. She no longer saw herself as the girl who had to keep her dreams in the shadows, the one who had to silence her own voice for fear of not being good enough. She was now the woman who had claimed her space, who had refused to let her circumstances define her. The world, it seemed, was finally beginning to recognize her, but it was the recognition of her own worth that had made all the difference. As Emma stood on the edge of this new chapter, she realized that it wasn't the external opportunities that had changed her life, it was the way she had shifted her own perception of what was possible. The dreams she had once kept in the back of her mind, the ones she had pushed aside for fear of failure, were now right in front of her, alive and waiting for her to take the next step. And she would, not because someone had handed her an opportunity, but because she had finally given herself permission to take it. Emma's story was no longer one of waiting for the world to change for her. It was a story of stepping into her power, of taking ownership of her dreams, and of trusting that the opportunities she had longed for were not just a distant fantasy, but an inevitable reality waiting to be realized. She had given the world her music, and in return, it had opened doors she had never imagined. But the true opportunity lay in the fact that she had finally opened the door within herself. The rest was just a natural consequence of that inner transformation. The story of Emma's journey is not merely about her rise from a waitress to an artist, nor is it about her musical talent or the recognition she earned from strangers. At its core, Emma's story is a powerful lesson about the resilience of the human spirit, the importance of self-belief, and the profound truth that we all have the power to rewrite our own narratives. It is a story about the quiet courage it takes to challenge the limitations we place on ourselves and the societal expectations that try to define us. And ultimately, it is a story about how the pursuit of authenticity, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable, can open doors we never thought possible. For much of her life, Emma lived with the weight of doubt pressing on her shoulders. She was the girl who had big dreams but no clear path to achieve them. She was the girl who looked at the opportunities of others, wondering why they seemed so out of reach for her. She was the girl who had once believed that her dreams were too far-fetched, that her aspirations were too big for the life she was living. Like many of us, she had internalized the messages that told her she wasn't enough, that she didn't belong in spaces of greatness, and that the reality of life would always be far removed from the things she dreamed of achieving. But what Emma discovered, through a seemingly insignificant moment that was both humiliating and empowering, was that the greatest obstacle to her dreams had never been the lack of opportunity, nor had it been the judgment of others. It had always been her own belief in her limitations. The key lesson in her story is that the only thing standing between us and the life we desire is often our own fear and self-doubt. The external world can throw up all kinds of barriers, but it is our internal resistance to our own potential that keeps us from moving forward. When Harrison Grayson mocked Emma, calling her out in front of the entire room and challenging her to play the piano, it was not just an external attack. It was the crystallization of every doubt, every fear, and every self-imposed limitation she had ever had about her own worth and her dreams. In that moment, Harrison wasn't just belittling her. He was embodying the very voices of doubt that she had allowed to control her for so long. He was the manifestation of the people who told her that her dreams were too big, too unrealistic, that a girl like her didn't belong in a world of success and creativity. But Emma chose to rise above that. Instead of retreating, instead of shrinking back into the shadows where her dreams had always been too afraid to take flight, she walked toward the piano and she played. And when she played, she didn't just play the notes, she played her truth. She played her resilience, her hopes, her fears, and her life story. The music became the embodiment of everything she had kept hidden for so long, everything she had buried out of fear. What Harrison did not realize, and what Emma soon understood, was that in confronting the external challenge, she had broken the internal chains that had held her back for years. The lesson here is clear. When we allow our fears to control us, we deny ourselves the very opportunities we long for. Fear is not only an emotional response, it is a force that shapes our actions, our choices, and our capacity to take risks. But fear is also a liar. It tells us we are not enough, that we cannot succeed, that our dreams are foolish. And what Emma learned in that moment at the piano was that fear, when faced head-on, can lose its power. She realized that her worth was not defined by the approval of others, nor was it defined by the limitations others imposed upon her. Her worth was inherent in who she was, in her talent, and in the quiet courage to trust herself enough to share her gift with the world. The true power comes when we stop waiting for the right moment, the moment when all our insecurities and doubts have been silenced, and we start stepping into the moments of discomfort and fear. Because it is in those moments that we find our greatest strength. Emma didn't wait for the world to tell her she was ready. She didn't wait for someone to give her permission to pursue her dreams. She didn't need to wait for her life to be perfect or for all the obstacles to be cleared. She simply took the first step, played the first note, and in doing so she unlocked a new chapter of her life that had been waiting for her all along. This lesson isn't just about following dream sets, about understanding that we are worthy of the lives we want to create, even when we don't yet see how they will come together. It is about understanding that our potential is not limited by what we've been told or by the circumstances we find ourselves in. It is about knowing deep in our hearts that we have the ability to rise above the voices of doubt, whether those voices come from the outside or from within, and to create the space we deserve. The world will always have its critics, its people who are ready to tear us down. But those voices mean nothing if we don't let them control us. What matters is the voice inside us that says, "You are enough. You have something to offer. You belong here." Emma's story teaches us that we don't need to be perfect. We don't need to wait until everything aligns perfectly to take a step forward. We don't need to wait until we are free from fear, from doubt, or from insecurity. The only thing we need is the courage to show up, to be authentic, and to believe that we are worthy of the opportunities that come our way. What Emma did in that moment of vulnerability at the piano was show the world the power of authenticity. She didn't try to be something she wasn't. She didn't hide behind the expectations of others or the roles that had been assigned to her. She allowed herself to be fully present, fully real, and fully herself. And that was the moment when everything changed. Because when we are authentic, when we allow ourselves to show up as we truly are, we give others the permission to do the same. We give ourselves the space to grow, to evolve, and to chase the dreams we thought were too far out of reach. The key lesson here is simple, yet profound. We must stop waiting for the world to tell us we are worthy and instead start believing in our own worth. We must stop letting fear and doubt control our lives and instead step into our own power. Only then can we create the life we deserve, a life defined not by the limitations of our circumstances, but by the boundless possibilities of who we are and who we are capable of becoming. Emma's story is a testament to that truth, a reminder that the greatest opportunity we have is the one we create when we believe in ourselves enough to step into it. Call to action. Emma's story is one of resilience, courage, and the power of self-belief. It is a story that reminds us all that we have the ability to rise above the doubts and fears that often hold us back, to step into the fullness of who we are, and to claim our place in the world. It is a story about the strength that lies within us, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. But more than that, Emma's journey is an invitation, a call to action for all of us to stop waiting for the perfect time, the perfect circumstances, or the perfect approval. The time is now. And the only thing standing between us and the lives we desire is our willingness to take that first step. How often have we told ourselves that we are not enough? How often have we pushed our dreams aside because we felt unworthy or because the world told us they were too big? How often have we believed that we must wait for the right opportunity to come along, that we must wait for someone else to give us permission to be who we are meant to be. The truth is, we have all been guilty of letting fear dictate our actions, of letting self-doubt prevent us from taking the first step toward the life we truly want. But Emma's story teaches us that the moment we stop waiting for the world to change for us is the moment we take control of our own narrative. We do not need the approval of others or the perfect circumstances to begin. All we need is the courage to show up, to be authentic, and to take that first step, no matter how uncertain or daunting it may seem. Emma's breakthrough came when she stopped allowing the voices of doubt to dictate her worth. When she sat at that piano and played, she wasn't just showcasing her talent, she was claiming her power, her voice, and her place in the world. She was no longer willing to wait for someone to tell her she was worthy of success, recognition, or respect. She stepped into her authentic self, and the world responded. But it didn't respond because she was perfect or because her dreams had suddenly come true. Responded because she was real, because she had the courage to be herself, and because she believed, finally, that she deserved to take up space. This is the lesson for all of us. The life we want is waiting for us to show up. It is waiting for us to stop waiting for someone else to give us permission, to stop letting the doubts and insecurities keep us locked in the shadows. We don't need to wait for the world to tell us we are enough. We must start by believing in ourselves. We must trust that our dreams are valid, that our voice matters, and that we have the power to create the lives we desire. Every moment we spend waiting for the right time is a moment we could be using to build the life we've always dreamed of. The truth is, there will never be a perfect moment. The world won't hand us a neatly packaged opportunity. We must create it ourselves. Think about the dreams that have been locked away in your heart, the ones you've pushed aside because they seemed impossible, because they felt too far out of reach. Think about the parts of yourself that you've kept hidden out of fear of judgment, rejection, or failure. Now ask yourself, what would it look like to stop waiting and start acting? What would it look like to begin right now, with the resources you have, with the imperfect circumstances that are before you, and with the belief that you are worthy of your dreams? The key to unlocking your potential is not in waiting for the perfect circumstances to fall into place. It's in taking that first step, even when the path ahead is unclear. It's in having the courage to show up as yourself, to embrace your authentic self without apology, and to trust that by doing so, you will create the space for the opportunities that you need. Like Emma, you may not have all the answers, but you have everything you need to begin. The next step is yours to take. The only question is whether you will take it. There is no better time than now to start believing in your worth and pursuing the life you've always dreamed of. You don't have to wait for someone to validate your dreams or for the world to suddenly make everything easy. You simply have to take the first step. And like Emma, you'll find that once you start moving, the world begins to shift with you. The opportunities you thought were out of reach will come into view. The doors that once seemed closed will begin to open, but they will only open when you have the courage to walk toward them. So, I ask you today, what is it that you've been waiting for? What are the dreams that you've been putting off? The dreams that you've convinced yourself aren't possible? What would it look like for you to take that first step, to stop waiting for permission, and to start moving toward your goals? The time is now. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to be willing to show up for yourself and trust that you are enough. Just like Emma, you have the ability to transform your life. The only thing standing in your way is the belief that you can't do it. The truth is, you are more than capable, and the world is waiting for you to step into your power. The only question is whether you will answer the call. Will you choose to embrace your dreams, to stop waiting for the world to change for you, and to start creating the life you deserve? The time to start is now. Don't wait for someone like Emma to show you the way. Be the one to light the path for others. Your story could be next. It's time to begin. Emma's story is a powerful reminder that the only limits that truly exist are the ones we impose on ourselves. For years, Emma allowed fear, doubt, and the expectations of others to hold her back from pursuing her dreams. But when faced with a challenge that could have easily broken her, she chose to rise above. She chose authenticity over perfection, courage over comfort, and most importantly, belief in herself over the voices of doubt. Through this, she discovered a profound truth that the key to unlocking our fullest potential lies not in waiting for external validation, but in embracing our own worth and stepping boldly into the world with our unique gifts. Her journey teaches us that transformation doesn't happen overnight, nor is it dependent on the approval of others. It is a process of quiet defiance against the voices that tell us we are not enough, and a loud affirmation of our inherent value. By choosing to take that first step, no matter how daunting, Emma created a space for herself that had once seemed impossible. This is the call to action for all of us. Stop waiting for the world to change for you. Step into your power, believe in your worth, and take the leap toward the life you deserve. Remember, your story could be next, and the time to begin is now. The world is waiting for you to show up as your true, authentic self. Thank you for joining this journey of kindness, transformation, and true wealth. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the power of generosity, resilience, and the unexpected ways lives can change. See you next time.